World War One. We all know that this war was one of the most deadly conflicts in human history. The sheer destruction that was caused by the conflict, as well as the repercussions that followed, make this war one of the most impactful and perverse that the world has ever seen. Viewing it over 100 years after its conclusion, it seems that at some points the Germans and Central Powers became agonizingly close to achieving victory and beating the Allies. Who knows what would have happened if this was the case, but luckily thanks to my bad boy Chatgpt, we can ask and see how realistic this really was. So I asked ChatGPT how the Germans and the Central Powers could have won World War One, and what ChatGPT gave me back was a bit of a head scratch. Instead of giving me just one scenario that could have altered the outcome of the war in favor of a Central Powers victory, ChatGPT threw at me 10 different ways that they could have fought the war better, or supposedly. I'm going to go through all of them and separately rank their feasibility and see if they were actually viable options or if ChatGPT should change its name to ChatDMT. So the first option that ChatGPT spewed at me was that the Central Powers would have broken the stalemate on the Western Front in early 1917. I'm not even sure how this would have been achieved. They had already introduced new artillery and poison gas, which failed to make enough headway that seriously threatened the Western Front collapsing or Paris from falling. This sort of seems like the obvious answer to a question that doesn't really explain much. I'm not sure if I'm really feeling this one. I'm going to give this a 3 out of 10. This was kind of a stinker. ChatGPT is getting a little spicier here. For starters, it suggests that the Allies suffer from political division and combined war strategy, and that the Germans could have been triumphant from this. Whilst I agree that the Allies could have fallen apart by disagreements with one another, how much of this was realistically influenced by the Central Powers? They had assisted in sending Lenin to Russia in a sealed train, and had tried to sway Mexico into joining the war through the Zimmerman telegram, which wasn't the best idea. One way in which they could have created division amongst the Allies was through promising greater war gains to neutral powers and trying to persuade them that joining the Allies wasn't the best option for their country to take, which then leads us to the next point. Diplomatic maneuvering. So similar to the last point, ChatGPT says that economic incentives and promises of territorial gains to neutral countries could have persuaded other states to join the Central Powers. The first country that kind of comes to mind is Italy, and obviously we know in our timeline that Italy joins the Allies with the Treaty of London, and then were unable to receive all the promised war gains that were outlined in the treaty, and as a result received a mutilated victory at the war's conclusion. In an alternate timeline, Germany could have persuaded the Italians to join the Central Powers by convincing Austria to relinquish some of its border territory to them, so that they could remain neutral or even join their cause. This actually happened in December 1914 when the Italian Foreign Minister Sonnino went to Vienna to discuss with the Austrians some concessions so that they would remain neutral. However, nothing ever eventuated from this meeting. But a neutral or even Central Power Italy in World War One would have changed the game entirely. Although it's impossible to really say, and Italy was also quite insignificant in the long run, maybe the Germans and Austrians could have done a reverse Treaty of London and offered Italy really exorbitant offers and then backpedal later on. I do like this suggestion though. I'll give this a 7.5, although I'm not really sure what other countries they could have realistically rounded up besides Italy. Romania comes to mind, and they had a secret protocol with Austria-Hungary to assist them in case of a war if they were attacked. And they also had interest in Russian-owned Bessarabia, but just avoid the Zimmerman telegram, and I literally think Germany just wins the war in the later stages without the US getting involved. So yeah, both these points get about a 7.5. Alright, next up we have the collapse of the Russian front. Now this one's interesting because obviously in 1917 the Russians did have two revolutions and the Russian front did effectively collapse. ChatGPT suggests that the new Bolshevik government decides to negotiate a separate peace instead of negotiating a separate peace, which is what happened in our timeline. I didn't really understand what it meant by this, because obviously they did that. So I will say that if the revolution had occurred earlier or the Russian front collapsed earlier, then the Germans may have actually had a shot at winning the entire thing. Could the Germans have beaten the Russians any earlier though, or could the revolution or collapse in Russia have happened any earlier? I'm not sure how they could have influenced this. Espionage is one thing, and allocating more infantry to just fight the Russians would have had little effect, as conquering Poland, Ukraine, the Baltic states, Belarus would have had little effect on the Russians if they decided to pursue the war and continue to fight on, just like how they did in World War II and the Napoleonic Wars. So yeah, I'm not really sure how the Germans could have realistically changed the outcome of this. Perhaps they could have recruited Romania or the Ottomans as soon as the war started, but I really don't see how that would have had any serious impact on the Russians collapsing. I'm going to give this one a 5 out of 10 because the point is good, but they don't really elaborate on anything. Alright, next up we have strategic innovations. Now, this ties into the first point of breaking the stalemate on the Western Front through the usage of innovative technologies. ChatGPT specifically suggests that poison gas and better artillery would have significantly impacted the outcome of the war, which in my opinion would have been negligible because to be honest, I think the introduction of planes and tanks was one of the major reasons as to why stalemate warfare disappeared and wasn't a major part of later wars such as World War II. Could this have been achieved during World War One? The only German tank that was present in World War One was the A7V, a complete brick of a development which, while present and successful in combat, also would not have been able to be mass produced by any means during the war. This suggestion, while plausible, does not seem super feasible, so I give this a solid 4 out of 10. Successful U-boat campaign at number 6. So the German U-boat campaign seems like a bit of a catch-22 for the Germans. On one hand, if the campaign was more successful, it would have seriously crippled the Allied economies, particularly if it had access to the channel ports in Belgium. On the other hand, the U-boat campaign, alongside the stupid Zimmermann telegram, were the two main reasons that brought the US into the war. So what could be a successful U-boat campaign? If they had never began the unrestricted part of their campaign, was there potential for the US to never enter the war on the side of the Allies? I'm still under the belief that the Zimmermann telegram was the major reason as to why the Americans entered the war. But let's say hypothetically that the Germans did not partake in their U-boat campaign, or they seriously minimized it and focused their war efforts on taking over continental Europe and not try to challenge the British. There's a very good chance that the Americans would not enter the war in 1917. So, what was a successful U-boat campaign then? Was it one that just didn't exist at all, or was it severely minimized? ChatGPT suggests that the Germans could have perfected their U-boat campaign, although with the technology that's available during World War One and the knowledge that they were always outnumbered by the British, kind of pushes them into a situation where that if they were to operate U-boats, then they were always going to label the area around the UK as a war zone, and that there was a great chance of antagonizing neutral countries like the US and Brazil. Incidents such as the Thrasher and RMS Lusitania don't exist and don't polarize the US population into being pro-Allied. It's an interesting thought. So, well played, ChatGPT. I give you a 7 for this bad boy. Alright, so up next we have the mobilization of the colonial forces. Let's see, at the outbreak of World War One, the German colonies included modern-day Cameroon, German Southwest Africa, German East Africa, Togo, as well as some small islands in the Pacific, parts of New Guinea, and the Chinese port of Tsingtao. For starters, this is not very cohesive to work with. All the colonies or possessions are disjointed and would get overrun by the Allied, particularly the British and French colonial possessions, even if they were to recruit more of the native population to their cause. This is probably the worst suggestion by ChatGPT when it comes to sheer feasibility, so I'm putting this at like a 2. Alright, so next up we have the Allied internal strife. Now, this is actually a pretty good reason, but how can the Germans and the Central Powers actually capitalize on this or create more internal strife? Do they invest heavily in espionage or try to make Russia collapse earlier? Do they attempt to fund uprisings in Allied nations such as the Finns, Poles, Balts in Russia, or the Irish in the UK? Internal strife did actually make Germany and the Central Powers very much nearly win the whole war through the Russian Revolution. If it had happened earlier, there's a very good chance that this could have made them sign an armistice and then focus heavily on knocking out the Allies on the Western Front. If similar uprisings or revolutions were to occur in France or Britain particularly, then the conflict would have very much resulted in a Central Powers victory. However, the in which to accomplish this remains very vague, which seems to be a recurring theme with ChatGPT, so I'll give this a solid 5 out of 10. So up next at number 9 is weakened United States involvement. Now this suggestion is a banger. We all know that the US came to the aid of the Allies in 1917-1918 at a pivotal time as Russia had pulled out of the war and the Germans were now focusing their strength on the Western Front. If the US does not enter the war, or enters it even later than it did, there is a very real chance that the Central Powers, while maybe not winning the war entirely, still take over large parts of France and then sue for a peace with more favourable terms. They could have done this just by not focusing on unrestricted submarine warfare, which was a strategy that probably antagonized more than it accomplished. If everything else went the same way in our timeline, where Russia collapses in 1917, then they very could have realistically won the war in France soon afterwards. This is a banger suggestion, so I leave this at an 8. Finally, boys, the last suggestion is negotiated settlement. So, ChatGPT suggests the negotiated settlement, which is the mounting casualties of the war forcing the Allies to sue for peace. With battles such as Verdun, it's really no surprise that this sort of line of thinking exists. People were literally being meat grinded, and casualties were amounting on both sides of the war the longer it went on. I would say that the best case for a negotiated settlement for the Central Powers happens in the earlier stages of the war, because the longer it drags, both sides commit such resource and manpower to the conflict that it becomes a war of attrition and both sides become hell bent on trying to win. Maybe the best case scenario for Germany and the Central Powers for a negotiated settlement happens in 1915 and at the latest in 1916. I would pinpoint when Serbia and Montenegro collapse or after the Gallipoli campaign fails to achieve any significant headway. Negotiating at this point in the war would have achieved some interesting results. However, the front lines at this point in the conflict were definitely Central Powers favoured in Europe at least. This is an alright suggestion, so I give it a 6. So, overall, that's what the AI gave me. Some solid points, others were a bit vague and not very viable in a real timeline. The overall mark is a 5.5, so if you were to churn this bad boy in an assignment, then you'll be passing, but it won't be too hot. However, it also is not chat DMT level. However, it is literally an AI program, and I don't expect it to understand the intricacies of something as complex as a global war. I personally like the diplomatic maneuvering and not angering the American public as the best options for the Central Powers to take the dub. So, what do you guys think? What did you think of ChatGPT's answers? Did they surprise you? Were they a bit average, a bit mid? Would you rank them lower or higher? How do you think the Central Powers could have won? Were there any points missed? Cheers for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one.